Okay, let's dive into this. You've brought us some really fascinating sources today looking at a huge global health problem, cancer.
Hmm.
And specifically, they're exploring this pretty interesting angle using old drugs, anti-parasite meds actually, to potentially fight it.
That's right. Drug repurposing.
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack what your sources say, the
Yeah.
potential, what the research actually shows from the lab bench to, well, some early trials and also the big challenges involved.
Yeah, it's crucial. Cancer is still such a major issue, and we desperately need new, effective treatments, preferably ones we can develop relatively quickly.
And repurposing seems like a shortcut, maybe?
Yeah.
Saves time, saves money compared to starting from absolute scratch.
Potentially, yes. It can save a lot of time and expense because you already know a lot about the drug safety profile, how it behaves in the body, that sort of thing. And cancer treatment is definitely a hot area for this kind of research.
And these particular sources zero in on drugs originally for parasites. You've got the benzimidazoles, that's albendazole and mebendazole, and also ivermectin. It sounds like scientists think they might do more than just kill worms.
Well, yes. The idea is that the way these drugs work, the biological pathways they interfere with in parasites, some of those pathways might be relevant in cancer cells, too.
Okay, so how does that work? Like with mebendazole, the sources seem to highlight that one.
Right. Mebendazole is a good example. It came out way back in 1971, an anthelmintic, basically, an anti-worm drug.
Right.
But then preclinical work, so studies in labs and animal models, started showing it had some activity against glioblastoma.
Glioblastoma, that's a really aggressive brain cancer, isn't it?
Extremely aggressive.
Yeah.
So finding anything that shows promise there is significant.
And that lab promise led to actual human studies? What did the sources say about clinical data for mebendazole?
Yeah, this is where it gets quite interesting. One source detailed a phase 1 clinical trial. They took patients newly diagnosed with high-grade gliomas, these serious brain tumors, and added mebendazole to their standard treatment.
Okay, phase 1, so that's mainly about safety and figuring out the dose, right? Not proving if it works yet.
Exactly. Primary goal,
Hmm.
safety, toxicity, finding the maximum tolerated dose.
So how did it fare on the safety front?
They pushed the dose pretty high, up to 200 millibeccolic a day, and the main finding was it showed long-term safety and generally acceptable toxicity, even at those levels.
Any side effects crop up?
The main thing noted was reversible elevated liver enzymes, but really only at that highest dose level. And it went back to normal when they adjusted the dose. So manageable, it seems.
Okay, that sounds promising on the safety side. Did they mention anything, even preliminary, about, well, how patients did? I know it's phase 1, but still.
They did report some early survival data. The median overall survival for the group getting mebendazole was 21 months.
21 months. Now, for glioblastoma, is that
Uh,
significant?
For this type of cancer, yes, that's a figure that definitely makes you take notice. It's preliminary, of course, small study, safety-focused, but it suggests it's worth investigating further in larger trials focused on efficacy.
And how does it supposedly work against the cancer, same way as against parasites?
Largely, yes. It binds to tubulin, which is a key protein for the cell's structure, its skeleton, if you like. That disrupts the cancer cells, much like it disrupts parasite cells. But the sources also suggest it might hit other targets too, like inhibiting certain kinases involved in cancer growth signals, so potentially multiple effects.
Okay, so mebendazole has some human trial data. What about the other two mentioned, ivermectin and albendazole? What's their status according to these sources?
For those, it's mostly preclinical promise right now. Ivermectin has shown antitumor properties in lab and animal studies. And interestingly, data from human trials where ivermectin was used for other things suggests the drug levels you can achieve in people's blood might actually be higher than the levels that worked against cancer in animals.
Okay. Though one source did throw in a caution flag there, didn't it? About ivermectin and its use for things like COVID.
Ah, yes, that's an important point. The source noted that while some groups promoted ivermectin for viruses based on lab dish studies, larger clinical trials in humans didn't show it worked for things like COVID, flu, or RSV.
Right, so it's a good reminder what happens in a test tube doesn't always translate to people.
Absolutely critical distinction. And for albendazole, similar story promising lab and animal data suggesting anti-tumor effects. It gets quickly metabolized in the body to an active form, albendazole sulfoxide, which reaches pretty high levels in the blood.
So both show promise in the lab, but the key difference compared to mebendazole seems to be less human cancer trial data.
Exactly. Based on these sources, there's a noticeable lack of completed human clinical trials, specifically testing ivermectin or albendazole for cancer, unlike the phase 1 work done with mebendazole.
Okay, so let's pull this together. We've got these old anti-parasite drugs. Mebendazole has some early, interesting human safety data in brain cancer, plus a plausible mechanism. Ivermectin and albendazole have intriguing lab results, but what's the big hurdle? Why aren't these potentially cheaper options being fast-tracked if they show promise?
Well, that's the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources point squarely at the challenges of repurposing generic drugs.
Generic, meaning cheap, off-patent. Why is that a problem? Shouldn't that be a good thing?
Would think so. But here's the catch-22 the sources describe.
Wow.
Because they're generic, there's no patent protection. No long market exclusivity period like you get with a brand new drug.
Right.
So commercial companies, the ones with the deep pockets, needed for massive phase 3 trials and navigating the whole regulatory approval process, they're hesitant to invest.
Because they can't guarantee they'll make their money back.
Precisely. There's no clear path to recouping the, frankly, enormous costs involved in proving a drug works for a new indication like cancer and getting it officially approved for that use. Anyone could potentially sell the generic version once it's shown to work.
And academic researchers can't just pick up the slack.
Often, they lack the funding, the sheer scale of infrastructure, or sometimes the specific expertise needed for those huge late-stage trials and the complex marketing authorization process. It's a massive undertaking.
So the system itself creates a barrier for these potentially useful, affordable drugs. What did the sources suggest as a possible way forward?
They really pointed towards the need for increased public funding. Governments, maybe nonprofits, stepping in to support not just the research, but potentially also helping to carry successful candidates through that whole costly regulatory approval pathway if the trials pan out.
So this deep dive really paints a picture, doesn't it? On one hand, real potential. Old drugs, maybe new tricks against cancer, mebendazole showing some early clinical signs, the others with lab promise.
Definitely potential.
But on the other hand, these major systemic roadblocks, the very fact they're cheap and widely available makes it incredibly hard to fund the definitive studies needed to prove they work for cancer and get them officially approved for patients.
Significant paradox.
It really leaves you thinking, in a world that desperately needs more effective, affordable cancer treatments, how do we fix this? How can we build better bridges between finding these new uses for old drugs and actually getting them into the hands of the patients who stand to benefit?